Well, friends, welcome to part three in our three-part series on Methodism. Part one, we looked at John Wesley, the origins of Methodism, which sort of stamps who we are, how we got to be who we are. Part two looked at sort of the Methodist DNA, what we think, how we act, what we're about as Methodists when we're at our best. We don't always get there, of course. So today I want to come to what's going on in the denomination in the United Methodist Church. There's a lot that's going on. We have this big general conference, supposed to meet every 4 years, been postponed twice due to COVID. It's something. And I could find no better guests to bring on board than my longtime friend, who's become really the leading bishop in all of this stuff that we've been doing, Ken Carter. And Ken agreed to talk with me. I think you'll learn a lot from his time with us here. So, friends, it's my privilege to be here today, introduce you to Bishop Ken Carter. Ken, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's wonderful to be here, James. Yeah.
We were colleagues together back in when we were in Charlotte together, and you're coming back to Charlotte to be our bishop. We're excited about that.
I am too. And I remember our meals we would have at Providence Sundries.
Yeah. You and Pam doing all right during this pandemic time?
We're just making our way through like everyone else. We are, but
I've seen her first at Lake Junaluska.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So we want to talk about Methodism, and we're coming to some kind of climax, we think, about what's been a really long, difficult struggle. And you and I have both done all we could to keep the church together. That's just a commitment, a passion, and there's just a lot of grief over the idea of it falling apart. Yeah. So say a little more about that. What's that been like for you over these many years?
Well, I was a pastor first for 28 years, a lot of that in Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and Charlotte, almost all of it. And always in those churches, and a couple of them were large churches, you would have people across a very broad spectrum. And in a local church, it's work, as you know, and you're masterful at it, but it's something you just work on week by week, year by year. And yet people with differences can sing in choirs together and read the Bible together and worship together. In the denomination, of course, we are across the United States, and even politically, we have, Jeff Sessions is a United Methodist, Hillary Clinton is, James Comey is, and on. Dick Cheney is. George and Laura Bush are. And so we've always had that kind of diversity in the United States. We're in 40 nations. Of course, we have profoundly different ways of seeing the world across this planet. And I believe it's just gotten more and more difficult. And yet, I would say that's been a real passion of mine to try to keep us together at the table and to see our primary identity as being created in God's image and followers of Jesus. Yeah.
I mean, I've said many times, we make these denominational decisions at these general conferences where laity and clergy from all over the world come together. Our church is unusual. We've had 2, 3, 4 delegates at all these conferences, which is unusual. It's only 1,000 delegates worldwide.
Right.
We worked on these things, but the problem is these are people who don't know each other, don't speak the same language. We come to the conference and we operate by Robert's Rules of Order, which you could not think of a worse way to try to conduct church business, but there it is. So in 2016, you and I were together at a conference in where were we? Portland.
Right.
And the topic of homosexuality came up, and there was kind of an eruption, and people said, we got to do this differently. Let's do something to get it done definitively. So they appointed a commission on the way forward, which you were not only a part of, you were one of the co-chairs of that. And so this is a group, a diverse group, right, of Methodists from all over the world. But you had this cool mediator, whose name I've forgotten.
Yeah. Well, the mediator, Ken Feinberg, actually came with us into the protocol. So that was a little later.
Yeah.
We, it was a 32-person group. The persons from groups like Reconciling Ministries and Good News and a whole spectrum in between, again, 4 continents. And the 32 persons were asked to work on what is our way forward, given our differences around, especially LGBTQ identity and inclusion. And so we did that work for about 18 months. And when I was asked to be one of the moderators of that group, I quickly sort of got disengaged from everything in my life except being the Bishop of Florida. And I tried to really listen all across the church, and including a visit to Africa with their leaders and their bishops. And all that work went into the 2019 General Conference, which, we were both there. And it was really to try to present models for how we could continue to be together as a church. And that's what led into St. Louis and that General Conference.
And then, so y'all were heroic. You did a wonderful job. You came together with a plan that could have kept us together. I remember you preached at that conference. It was just one of the finest, most timely sermons I've ever heard in my life. I was really moved by that. But that legislation was defeated, right. And that just left everybody just broken. And why did that fail? Why do you think that didn't pass?
That's a great question, and 2 or 3 answers kind of begin to, I guess, help us toward a picture of it. The first was the vote was very close. There was a model that was called the One Church Plan, which would have allowed us to remain as a denomination, for there to be differences across local churches. In Charlotte, in Western North Carolina, in Florida, there are United Methodist churches who are very different. We appoint different clergy to them. They have different emphases, but they're part of the cross and the flame, and they're connected. And so the One Church Plan did not prevail. It was a somewhat narrow vote. And as you'll remember, there were voter irregularities, and this was reported on in the New York Times. There were persons who voted at St. Louis who never entered the United States. And this was documented in the New York Times. I was interviewed about that. And it was also clear that the United States delegates clearly had a preference for a way for us to be together, but for us not to have this language in our Book of Discipline, the discriminatory language around human sexuality. And so we left that meeting. It was very demoralizing. It was demoralizing to everyone, certainly to those who saw themselves defined by the church as not being a part of the church. At the same time, conservatives, evangelicals, traditionalists told me they were really demoralized and exhausted by it. And the next step very quickly was a bishop named John Yambasu, who was from Sierra Leone, began to try to pull people together on a next step. He just felt kind of moved by the Holy Spirit to do this. And again, to make a longer story more brief, he began meeting with some of the same kinds of persons. The Council of Bishops kind of blessed it, although it was not an official group, but it was kind of blessed in terms of the bishops who were a part of it. But again, it had people from the 4 continents, had very traditional people, very progressive people, local church pastors, LGBTQ persons. And we began to realize that we needed some kind of guidance in this beyond the legislative work that we've been doing. As you say, it's just hard for 1,000 people to get together in a room where there's a lot of mistrust. And so a small group went to see Kenneth Feinberg, who is kind of a world-renowned mediator. He's a man of Jewish faith. And we had a connection with him, and we asked him if he would help us toward a mediated outcome. And a wide variety of people were open to this. Now, Kenneth Feinberg has mediated the 9/11 Survivors Fund, the Virginia Tech victims, the Deepwater Horizon. He's now working on the Jeffrey Epstein survivors of the misconduct, sexual violence. And he said to us he would help us. And the next amazing thing was he says, I will do this pro bono. He said, you will not see even a receipt for a cup of coffee. And you and I both know Greg Palmer, Bishop Greg Palmer. He said, it's amazing when people outside our village have more faith in us than we have else.
Yeah.
And so we actually, a group of about 15 of us met for, again, a year and a half or so. We always met at some law offices in D.C. They were made available to us at no cost. If I shared the name of it with you, there are people on the Supreme Court who've been a part of this law firm, and they simply tried to help us toward an outcome. And the result of that was the protocol, which is not perfect. And from my point of view, it's really in the hands of delegates like you. It's in the hands of the clergy and lay delegates. It's not an end result, but it is a way for us to get to the next place.
As so often happens, I start recording at home and there's a buzzsaw going outside. And that's one of the things that happens with church, right? We meet and we think we're talking Bible, church, God, right. But there's all the background noise, which is people's political ideology and all that kind of, comes into the room. Right. And the key question, I guess, in all that is, there's this thing that people always quote John Wesley. We had 2 sessions ago. Ryan Danker came and talked to us about John Wesley, the origins of Methodism. That was really good. And there's this thing that people always quote Wesley as having said that he probably didn't actually say, which is that, in essentials, unity, and non-essentials, liberty, in all things, charity. That's a great saying. Wesley may not have said it. It's kind of like the prayer of St. Francis, make me an instrument. Francis didn't actually do that. But it's still pretty good. That's kind of a Methodist thing. We want to be unified in our essentials, but then there are things that are non-essential. And the question really has come down to, is human sexuality the essential or not the essential? And I'm one who's argued that the essentials are things about God. The truth about God, Jesus, God incarnate, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the gift of the Holy Spirit, all those things that are about God. Human responses to that are going to vary all over the place with different cultures, but not everybody agrees with that.
Right. I loved being a pastor. I've gotten a lot of meaning out of serving as a bishop. And when people are ordained, we ask them these historic questions about the doctrinal standards. You and I probably were asked these questions at Lake Junaluska when we were ordained. And if you read the doctrinal standards of our church, which come from Wesley, which are in the Book of Discipline, they say nothing about human sexuality, nothing about gender identity or sexual orientation. I actually argued this before the Judicial Council. And someone we both know, Tom Langford, who a native of Charlotte, dean and provost at Duke, chaired the theological task. And to me, what I've come to believe is the doctrinal standards are the core, but the theological task is how we relate our doctrine, which is scripture and worship and everything else, the tradition, to these life experiences that come to us. And I saw as a pastor, I can distinctly remember when I was a pastor at Providence, more than one family calling me and saying, our son is gay. Can we meet for breakfast in the morning and talk about this? And these parents were simply trying to apply their Christian faith to their life experience. And I believe that's what we're trying to do. And I've talked a lot about this in relation to my mother, who grew up not in the Methodist Church, but in the Deep South. And when she and my father, their marriage ended, and she was asked by her local church, of which she was a longtime member of, she was sort of said, two or three people said to her, it might be good if you found another church. And this was not that unusual in the late 1960s, early 1970s in the Deep South. It was unthinkable for a pastor to be divorced, for a Sunday school teacher to be divorced, for the authorized leader of a church to be divorced. How did the church change its mind about that? Again, nothing in our doctrinal standards are about this. And I believe there's an analogy with homosexuality that as we are going through the same process and people are wondering, how can I integrate my faith with what I see in the lives of these persons? And we figured that out with marriage and divorce. At one time, our book of discipline had statements in it about divorce, and this was 100 years ago, and those were changed over time. And so I believe myself to be very traditional in terms of an generously orthodox faith. We had many of the same teachers in divinity school. I have a high view of Scripture, a high view of the resurrection, divinity of Jesus, virgin birth. And for me, I've come to believe this is really a conversation about grace, the grace of God, and about what holiness means. And, the Wesleys when they talked about holiness, they really talked about love of God, love of neighbor. And in a local church, that's what you do. You love God through worship. We love our neighbor by trying to make a difference in each other's lives and be there for each other. So we're just in the midst of all this, and it's messy.
Oh man, and I get frustrated. I understand it, but one side wants to say we're the Bible people. Well, we're all Bible people.
Absolutely.
We're the holiness people. Nobody wants to be the unholiness people. Everybody inclusive. Everybody will say they're inclusive. I'd always rather us err on the side of hospitality, welcome people into the church. I know I've been impressed by. We have gay Christians in our church family who are amazing. Their level of devotion to God and prayer and worship, and that's really an impressive thing. So just in a nutshell, the protocol, what does that allow for? It's not like a split of the denomination in half exactly, is it?
No, it's not. And, I was just privileged to be a part of all of those face-to-face meetings with these two or three really world-class legal mediators who had no stake in this other than to try to help us. And, my understanding of mediation is, and I know Myers Park must have a number of people who do this for a living, that in mediation, none of us ever gets everything that we want. But the best mediation gives each party the most that they can possibly be given. And so for more traditional conservative persons, and I don't like the labels, I often find people share these labels about themselves. What I understood they really wanted was for their local churches, their property, and if they were clergy, their pensions. But they really were not devoted to the United Methodist brand. Often they would sort of minimize the label of United Methodism or the Cross and the Flame or those kind of things. And often these churches would support mission work and ministries that were beyond United Methodism, autonomous churches, non-denominational ministries, etc. For more center and progressive persons, and I would say this would be not only about human sexuality, but about race, but about women in ministry. It cuts across a number of things. They really wanted the removal of this sentence in our book of discipline. Why over 40 years we've singled out one kind of person for this kind of focus or discrimination. the removal of that, because it is an obstacle for people in our lives and in our local churches. And, the question I've asked, I've often said to persons, think about a person in your church who is gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgendered. They were perhaps baptized in the church. They were confirmed in the church in a youth group, maybe a campus ministry. They maybe sing in a choir. They're in a Bible study. They give to the church. They give to capital campaigns. You and I both have done this. At the end of their life, do they have to wonder, was this ever really my church? And in black and white, we have had this in our discipline. And I think it's part of this is we only meet every 4 years. Part of it is we're not a national church. We're a global church. Part of it is the delay of the pandemic. And so the protocol removed that sentence. And then in the midst of the conversations, the more traditional voices said, finally, they said, we really do want to depart. And these are the resources we need to begin our new church. And so that was their preference, to depart and to begin something new. For me, it meant the continuing United Methodist Church. And another insight I came to along the way was, I don't use the language of the church splitting, but there was a resolution in St. Louis to dissolve the United Methodist Church. Well, if the United Methodist Church dissolved, I believe people like you and me, James, we would find a way to fulfill our calling. We would find a way to serve, find a way to function, but a lot of people would be vulnerable. And the people who would be vulnerable are people who don't have the kind of privilege we have. And that's a part of what I love about the connection. I was at Providence, you're at Myers Park. These kinds of churches do an incredible amount of good in the city and the state, in the world. And so there are many things about our connection. We're not a perfect church by any means. We need reform. But there are many things about our connection that are life-giving to many people. And I wanted the continuity of that. And then lastly, I'll just say for right now, something that really changed, and it ties to what you said at the beginning, was actually something a mutual friend of ours said to me. After the work of the Commission on the Way Forward ended, and I was a moderator in that, so I needed to be neutral. I needed to work with all parties. But this person said, unity cannot be at someone's expense. And so there are sometimes people who are harmed by unity in families and communities and denominations. And I do want unity, and I believe we can be a big tent church or a big table church. I truly believe that. And that's what I'm working for, and I'll continue to work for it when I'm in Western North Carolina. I don't want anyone to leave. No one has to leave. And yet we don't need to single out any groups of people as being people who can't be a part of that. And so I think to me, that was where all this was leading, where the protocol was leading. When we have a general conference, the protocol will be taken up by the delegates. And in our church, we share authority. We share it among bishops and delegates and other groups. And that's just a part of the way we do our work. Do our politics, and you've thought about this in a pretty wise way. Politics is simply a way we make decisions together, hopefully in a nonviolent way, and so I think so that's what's ahead. In the meantime, we've got a lot of work to do with helping the church to be vital, just week to week, and having worship and trying to get through this pandemic, and then the work around reckoning with racism and the public health crisis. And my sense has been this, for at least for me, for the last year or so, those things took up all the oxygen in the room. In other words, trying to keep the church going week to week, and you were on the front lines of it, and I've really been grateful for what you and people of Myers Park have done. Trying to keep the church there week to week for people who are living through a disaster, and then the reckoning with racism, these public experiences of racism, and then the polarization of politics, and then the fear, the justifiable fear many people have about COVID, and when they have health complications or their children, or just how we begin to move back towards some semblance of community life. We've been working with all that. For me, most of that's taken up all the oxygen in the room, but now we're beginning to think about these structural questions, and that's appropriate.
Yeah, I personally am. I'm not happy. I grieve that this institution that I've loved and given my life to is going through this. But at the same time, the way it's turned out is happy relatively for me, and I think for the Myers Park Church. Instead of being a split down the middle and we'd have to vote and decide, we're United Methodists and we're going to stay.
Right.
And that's a wonderful thing. And you mentioned the labels are so dangerous. I hate to use the term conservative. I have conservative things in me. I have conservative people in my church, but we want to be together. We want to be, our dream is to be the big tent church. We're going to have conservatives. We're going to have progressives. We're going to be a church, right? We're not going to be a liberal church or progressive church or conservative church. We're a church. Right. We want to do that. And the denomination thing, this whole thing kind of makes you ask, why do we bother with a denomination in the first place? And we've had structures that kind of were invented, I always say in the Middle Ages, probably in the 50s.
Right.
It might be a time to reshape all that. To me, a denomination's virtue ought to be missional. We do stuff together to make an impact on this area. Besides that, I can't think of many reasons to organize except to encourage one another. Do you think, is a big tent church, is that possible?
Well, I think.
Please say yes.
Yeah, I think it is. And I would say, I agree with you about denominations and institutions. Most of us do not like institutions. Most of us need the things institutions do.
Okay.
And so a local church, a big church, is kind of like an institution. And so is a denomination. So is what happens in a large city. But our institutions need to be healthy, and they need to always keep in mind the purpose for which they were initiated. Think about an institution like the Duke Endowment or, large foundations. These are institutions that are life-giving to people. I would say, one of the things we heard in the protocol and is in the protocol is that no local church has to vote whether it is United Methodist or not. We heard this from a lot of especially strong church pastors. We don't want to vote, and churches do not have to vote. You are a United Methodist church. You can be a United Methodist church. And a part of the work of some of the facets of this, the One Church plan, is how, you mentioned denomination, how denomination can listen to what a local church needs. You've got a pretty clear identity as a local church. How the denomination can listen to what this local church needs so it can fulfill its mission. And cities are different. Urban, rural is different. Traditional, more center progressive is different. And I think to me, the idea of a big tent church or a church with a large table where everyone is welcome, that's really, I believe, the future. And I think demographically, generationally, as I've jokingly said to a lot of churches, your church may be an outlier in this, but most churches have a few places where new people could come in and sit. Most churches have space for people to come and worship there. We don't need to be in the business of drawing a line and saying, we want this kind of person, not this kind of person. And we're all on a journey. We're all on a journey in almost all of this. And Wesley was on a journey. The later John Wesley was not the earlier one. And that's true for most of us. And so we're adapting. And again, adaptation, there's so many changes going on in the world. And you and I probably never imagined doing the kind of ministries we've been doing the last 2 years. And we're all adapting. So the gospel doesn't change, but the soil we planted in does change, and people's lives change. And there's a lot of anxiety, and there's a need for anchors in people's lives. And a church like Myers Park is an anchor for many people. And in the midst of all these other kind of changes, there's a need for that. And so a part of the protocol was to try to allow as much good as possible to flourish in the future. And my sense is that can happen.
Yeah, and we'll have the, I think, privilege of remaining United Methodist. There are times I've blushed over saying I'm a United Methodist, but it can be a thing that we can be proud of. And a church so we have a building campaign, and under the protocol, there's no way we will lose our property. Some denomination's not going to take our property, so we can build a $32 million building. But part of what I love about what we're doing and the way we try to think about it, it's not like this is a building for us, but this is a light to the world. This is a message to the community that there is a God, that God cares. We care. And the thing about being a big tent church, our society needs to see this. All we see on TV is how to argue and bicker and be really angry, but we can model for how to love each other, how to listen to each other. World needs that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Candace, thank you for your time and wisdom. And you've been such a great, I mean, when you were elected bishop, I thought, wonder how he's going to do. You've been a great bishop.
Well, thanks.
And it's exciting that you'll be our bishop. Yeah. And we want to help you in any way. So please let us know how to do that. But thank you for your time and thoughts on all this. And we'll hold our beloved denomination in prayer as we move forward and believe that God's going to do some new thing. So, friends, that was super interesting. And stay tuned to what unfolds. Again, we're United Methodists. I'm proud to be United Methodist. There are days I blush a little, but there it is. Everything's like that. And, our church is going to move forward. We have a bright future. I think our denomination even has a bright future. We can focus on the things of God and being missional and making a difference in the world. I look forward to being part of that with you. If you have questions about Methodism, reach out to me, any of us at staff at church. We're happy to try to help with that. And let's keep praying for the church, praying for God's will to be done through the church and even in spite of the church. So, friends, thank you so much.